Rick Griffin was born near Palos Verdes in California in 1944, so it was almost inevitable that in his teens he would become an obsessive surfer. But he was equally obsessed with drawing, and through a combination of his youthful talent and contacts he'd made in the surfing community, he went straight from school to work as the staff artist for Surfer magazine. While working there, he created Murphy, a graphically unremarkable character who nevertheless quickly became widely adopted as a mascot by his fellow surfers. In 1964, when he was 20 years old, Griffin left the Surfer to embark on a trip to Australia. He began the journey by hitching a ride to San Francisco, but the car he was riding in crashed, and although he survived, his left eye was badly damaged and his face permanently scarred. And not much later, his cartoon eye character would become a ubiquitous iconic presence for the rest of his career. He subsequently abandoned his plans for travel and enrolled into what is now the California Institute of the Arts. In 1966, he began experimenting with the drug LSD, which wasn't actually made illegal until later that year. The effect of his use of this drug and other hallucinogenics, such as mescaline, on his creative output was profound. In that year, he created his first poster for the band the Duke Savages, of which he was a member. He created another along similar lines for 1967's Gathering of the Tribes, an event which was credited with starting what would be called the Summer of Love. As the hippie movement grew and San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury scene developed, Griffin found himself in increasing demand for counterculture graphics and particularly posters for the new rock music which proliferated. A lot of his work at this time was created for Chet Helms and Bill Graham, who staged rock extravaganzas at the Avalon Ballroom and the Fillmore Auditorium. Both frequently commissioned him to create arresting images to promote their events, and Griffin responded with posters which more often than not had nothing at all to do with the actual performers. They were simply the surreal but compelling products of his formidable, admittedly drug-enhanced imagination. And the names of the featured bands appeared in increasingly difficult-to-read levels of distortion. He may have been the most visible and prolific poster artist of the time, but he wasn't the only one. And in 1967, Griffin joined forces with Alton Kelly, Stanley Miller, Victor Moscoso and Wes Wilson to form the Berkeley Bonaparte Agency, a collective dedicated to the production of psychedelic poster art. A lot of the work they produced had no function other than to give visual substance to the hippie movement and the drug culture it relied on. These posters were originated in blackline only. Colours were then added as both flat and tonal overlays in subsequent lithographic print runs, using the vibrant kaleidoscopic colour palettes Griffin and his associates were known for. In 1967, he created the original logo for Rolling Stone magazine, which for Griffin was reasonably legible, and it continued to be used as their masthead for quite a few years to come. Robert Crumb launched Zap Comics in 1968, initially as an exclusive showcase for his own outrageously provocative strips. But in subsequent issues he invited others, including Rick Griffin, to also submit sequential work for publication. Unlike Crumb and many of his contemporaries, Griffin wasn't a storyteller. In his strips there was rarely a coherent narrative, and instead he created a series of thematically connected surreal illustrations which usually made only aesthetic sense. The arrangement of his pages was always visually dynamic, and each panel was executed with immense precision and graphic balance. It was also in 1968 that Griffin began his professional relationship with the Grateful Dead, with a monochrome concert poster which displayed the same graphic intensity as his work for Zap. A year later he created another for the band, which featured a mesmerizing, typically symmetrical design in saturated colour. It proved immensely popular as a piece of art in its own right, and so did his cover art for the Oxo Moxoa album issued around the same time. And also in 1969 he was commissioned by John Severson to design a poster for his surfing film Pacific Vibrations, in which Griffin also appeared. This was one of the earliest examples of him actually creating a painted image, rather than the flatter line-based graphics he'd made his reputation with. He also resumed work for Surfer magazine and revisited his character Murphy, but by now the sequencing and graphic styling were a long way from his earlier, more mainstream origins. Griffin moved back to Southern California in 1969 and settled with his family in San Clemente, Orange County. Among other work in this prolific period, he created a darkly humorous strip sequence for the song Why Don't We Do It in the Road, which was published in the collaborative book The Beatles Illustrated Lyrics. And in 1970 he produced a series of comics under the collective banner The Man from Utopia. This was the ultimate collision of cosmic and comic imagery, executed with astonishing precision and graphic clarity. Using the comic book format, he created a line-only portfolio of wildly imaginative and frequently disturbing visionary images. And for the first time, among the usual symbolic paraphernalia of his work, some religious imagery was also stirred into the mix. In that year he'd become a born-again Christian, and although his incorporation of religious images was unconventional to say the least, it was nevertheless a genuine expression of his newfound faith. But he continued to produce secular work, including More for Zap and a surfing-themed comic, Tales from the Tube. In 1973 he created a collection of painted and graphic images to promote the Grateful Dead's album and tour The Wake of the Flood. And in addition to his ongoing relationship with them, he created memorable album covers for other bands in the 1970s. Among them was this painted cover for Sail on Sailor by Mustard Seed Faith from 1973. And his profoundly surreal airbrush comic image for this album by Help Yourself appeared in the same year. In 1976 he created the cover art for the album Slow Motion by Welsh rock band Man. Sadly, it wasn't used in this form as its depiction of Mad's Alfred E. Newman breached copyright, so this close-up replaced it. By now the painted and airbrush work was dominant in his output, and he created another surf film poster for Tales from the Tube in 1976. And in the later 70s he became involved with Maranatha Music, a Christian recording company, and he produced album covers and posters for various of their bands and performers. In 1980 his illustrated condensed edition of the Gospel of St. John was published, and these images were unlike anything previously seen in religious painting. Although clearly evangelical, they were every bit as hallucinatory and creatively explorative as his earlier secular images. Whether or not he'd continued to ingest LSD or other drugs at this time, none of the sources I've used wants to reveal. But it's possible that, like quite a few others, his earlier use had opened up his neural pathways, and it was by now redundant. The illustrations were painted, combining actual brushwork with airbrush application, and although they were undoubtedly a seriously intended body of work, they were largely rejected or ignored by orthodox mainstream Christianity. During the 1980s, Griffin's pace of commercial work was starting to slow down. The hippie golden age was gone, and fashions in music and graphics had moved on. But the Grateful Dead was still touring and making albums, and they continued to use his graphic talents for their promotional material. And as well as artwork for more religious rock music, there was an unused album cover for British rock band The Cult. In 1991, Rick Griffin's life was tragically and prematurely cut short. While riding his motorbike, he was involved in a serious collision with a van. He was rushed to hospital, but he died 3 days later from his injuries. He was 47 years old. Where his creativity and persistent visual imagination would have taken him in later life, we'll never know. And for those such as myself who consider Rick Griffin to be one of the greatest and most innovative illustrators and graphic artists of the 20th century, we just have to be grateful that in the short time he spent on the planet, he created so many enduring and iconic images.